Of a new book, The News, a User's Manual. Samira Ahmed, a journalist and presenter of Newswatch, the BBC programme which keeps a watch on how news is reported, and Alastair Campbell, former Fleet Street hack, best known for having served as Tony Blair's Director of Communications. Several times in your book, you make a comparison between religion and news. What do you mean?
Well, religion used to be the place you went to find out what was important, what mattered, what the meaning of life was. And all those things we've taken now to the news. The news is the thing that guides us, that tells us what's important. But the interesting thing is, we never think, here's something that we should learn to ingest with a little bit of care. We get taught how to read books, how to look at pictures. No one ever says, there's this thing called the news, and it's a very strange phenomenon, and you need to think of a few things before going near it. No one ever teaches us how to take in the news, and that's really what I'm interested in.
Do you recognise this picture, Alastair?
I do. I read Alan's book earlier today, and I do agree with a lot of the thesis, and I do think there is now a need for a kind of education about the modern media, because I think there's very little self-analysis within the media about itself. And I think some of the points he made, even within that film, we saw Emily earlier talking about Labour and the trade unions. Everything has to be presented as really new, really big, really important, the new this, the new that, the biggest since the last big thing. And that's because you
Of course.
Yes, I know. I'm not, but I'm saying that that's, you say of course, but part of your job as
you want us to come on air and say nothing much happened today,
well,
here's a few old stories.
Jeremy, you made a speech not many years ago where you said that some days you should do exactly that.
I think you probably should, and nobody does. But on a regular day, that is a significant story.
No, I'm not saying it's not a significant story. I'm not criticising Emily for the story. I'm simply saying that news has become what somebody, an editor, a presenter, decides is of interest. But for the viewer, yes, of course, I'm not saying that's new. I'm simply saying I agree with Alain that the reader, the viewer, people growing up in Britain today where the media is much more prevalent than it ever used to be, I think there is a need for people, in a sense, to get an education about where it's coming from and often why.
Right. OK, Samira, it is ubiquitous. You accept that?
It is, but the one thing I would agree with both Alain and Alastair on is that education is important. And I speak in schools a lot, and I'm always struck by the fact that essentially watching the news is like critical appreciation, and you should approach it with that critical detachment. And most young people actually get that very, very quickly, but they need to be taught it as part of a general thing. My greater concern is this idea that somehow the news is somehow not made by individuals who are it's somehow a force out there. And one, I think it gives a sense of community, and people can turn on and tune into a sense of what's going on in the outer world and feel connected to it in a positive way. Sometimes it makes them angry.
They can't do a damn thing about it.
Sometimes they can. I mean, an interesting example of a story which there's a lot of cynicism about how it's reported is the changes to the NHS, for example. Newswatch has got a lot of complaints over the last few months about they felt biased in the way it's reported. There's a whole political party that's been set up on that. Now, you could argue about what the truth of it is, but people have been motivated to take action. Another great example, just to give you one briefly, is because in your book you talk about this drip drip where news isn't given context. The Staffordshire hospital scandal, that emerged because individual stories of patients dying were being reported anecdotally to journalists.
But now
you've got a campaign,
we have coverage of the National Health Service right across the media that only wants to focus on the National Health Service being bad when the National Health Service is actually very, very good.
Well, everyone knows the National Health Service is pretty good, which is why when it goes bad, it's news.
No, but it used to be. I used to have a colleague on the Daily Miracle, Jill Palmer. She was the health correspondent. Her job was to write good stories about the National Health Service. She was laid off because basically the then editor, who I think was Piers Morgan, I can't remember, basically said there's no longer a market for these good stories about the National Health Service because the news and the nature of the news has changed.
But isn't that changed because of spin doctors then?
Right, let's decide what news
do you accept no responsibility for feeding a news agenda?
No, not at all. I really don't.
I just want to ask this one question. I mean, you said just a year or so ago that the one thing that still makes you wake up and think, did I really do that, was getting Tony Blair to join the Free Deirdre Rashid story. Yeah. Now, there's an argument that was a distraction, which the Murdoch press was very pleased to take up to distract from another story.
It was me responding to a question and having a bit of a laugh, and you're now years later remembering it and thinking it was serious.
You talked about it last year.
No, I did, but Jeremy, can I just say as well, Alan talked about the Olympics in the book.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really good example.
That was a good news story,
Exactly. But up until the point of the opening ceremony, the media was busting a gut. You could feel them thinking, God, I think this is going to go wrong.
I think the interesting
Not
thing
all of them, but the balance
like
of opinion.
Martin Lewis, frankly.
I think the interesting thing is that the news, when it's looking for corruption, and the news spends a lot of time looking for corruption, it always imagines that corruption comes in the handy shape of one bad egg that can be put in a prison van and taken away.
They don't
say
that.
No, but a lot of the problems facing our society are more complicated, and they don't involve criminal negligence. They involve stupidity, laxness, lazy thinking, etc. And that's very hard for the news machine to get its teeth into.
Well,
it isn't.
That's absolute tripe.
No.
What about government spending on computer systems, for example?
Absolutely,
that's
brilliant
not
story.
Criminality. That's just incompetence.
No, but a very important story.
Yeah.
But one that
very well reported.
Yeah, but one that really struggles. If you look at the figures of, say, who's clicking on the Justin Bieber going crazy in Panama City story versus who's clicking on stories of chaos in the DRC.
Well, I'm afraid we're not all imbued with your high spirits.
Sometimes you can have a bit of fun too.
No, I agree. But I think the real challenge is, in a sort of multi-channel world, is how do you get the most important news to be the most popular? At the moment there's a yawning divide between news which is important and news which is popular. And in a democracy that really matters. What you want to do is to yoke the two together.
That's another thing that comes throughout your book. You're always talking about what the news should do.
Indeed, I'm trying to make it better.
Well, no, you're not. You're trying to make it into something else.
Jeremy, you do that as well.
I think anyone who loves news is
anyone who's in this business
trying to do it.
Yes.
But that's the difference between good journalism and bad journalism. And a lot of your complaints are just about bad or sloppy journalism.
Absolutely. And let's get ambitious about what we can do. We're still one of the first generations to know about news, to have so much news on offer. We're still working out how it works. And I think it's natural we're a bit confused sometimes. We don't know how to handle,
You suggest it's got a moral purpose beyond informing people.
Yes.
That it should be changing them.
I think the point of the news is to make the nation flourish, to help the nation to go better. That's why we're interested in criminality. That's why we're interested in scandals, because we're trying to get things to go better.
But who makes that judgment?
Well, I think that's the collective, in a democracy, it's a collective voice of many news outlets.
No, but I can just say it gets better because you expose wrongdoing and people might challenge it. One of the most important aspects of news reporting, which you in your book write about quite cynically, about all these headlines about criminal trials, there's something really wonderful about seeing a criminal trial that brings bad people to justice. And sometimes it's an individual example, but you can change the law and you can change behaviour.
Alastair said something very interesting in a lecture he gave in Cambridge, saying, you quoted Carl Bernstein saying that Watergate had been the greatest journalistic story of the 20th century, but it had ruined journalism.
Yeah. Well, his point was that because Watergate was such a big story, and it's still the sort of yardstick, that now journalism is only journalism if it's bringing somebody down, preferably somebody in a position of real power. And that is not just... They may do, and that's part of the political debate.
Fred Goodwin and being stripped of his knighthood. I don't think there was a public appetite baying to say, take away his knighthood. There was a public appetite to say there's something wrong with the system.
That's hardly as big as Watergate.
But it isn't. And the point is that we had a government which very cynically threw him to the wolves and encouraged the news machine to kind of operate.
Possibly, that does happen. I agree that
But, we have a PR man who's our Prime Minister now. I mean, there's a kind of an interesting relationship between politics and an attempt to manipulate the news agenda,
there is,
which
but
you know all too well about.
I do know all about it, but let me say this, that I think that the relationship between media and politics, let me give you one example. You look at this wall, there's more media than ever. Yeah. Even when I was on the Daily Mirror, there were 2 reporters whose job was to cover debates in Parliament. We now have thousands of hours a day, and you can go into Parliament, which is meant to be the sort of cradle of democracy, the rest of it. There's nobody in there covering it.
There's no one on the benches half the time.
No, but then that feeds itself.
I agree. There's an issue about political reporting.
And then they say, well, we've got the Parliament channel, which nobody watches. So I think, I agree with that. I think part of your job, the Media Collective, is to say it's not just about sales, it's not just about ratings. We are part of an important process involving the public.
Politicians have to not try and play that game where they're creating little policy ideas and trying to feed
But they wouldn't be doing that if they didn't feel they were forced onto this agenda the whole time. Go to more mature countries like Germany, you'll find there's less of it going on.
Maybe. Well, can I just bring it back to the viewers? Because every week we have people who email in, and I think your book implies that somehow people feel helpless and they somehow are manipulated by the news.
Social media is giving them a
Well, I
big
think
voice.
we can kind of put too much emphasis on social media. Most people are not on Twitter engaging in conversations. A lot
Most
of
young
journalists
people aren't watching the BBC.
Right.
But
Look,
an awful lot
as
of
you know,
audiences
the media have a very short attention span.
are very aware
story.
of what's going on.
now.
To the next scandal.
But you can always contact Newswatch and complain about bad
Yeah.
coverage, and we'll tackle it with BBC
And
bosses.
too little time.
Editor of
given to things
Newsnight
too.
has yet to commit to a date to come on. We've been asking for months. With another date.
Yeah, come on. Where's the editor of Newsnight? Come
I
on,
agree.
get on there.
If he
Thank you.
doesn't come, I will.
Good, bad, Jeremy.
Promise.
We want